Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jocelyn Gardner, founder and chair of Print London, and on behalf of our collective, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second in a series of artist talks called Exploring Intaglio, Making Conceptual Magic. For this series, we've invited Ontario-based artists to speak about how they incorporate intaglio into their wider practices. Described by Crown Point Press in San Francisco as a magical medium, these artists are all manipulating it in fresh and inspiring ways as a means of expressing contemporary ideas and issues. Whether fragmenting plates, working with layering through chine-collé and collage, mixing media, or incorporating intaglio into sculptural and installation formats, they're all pushing the boundaries of one of the oldest printmaking techniques. Tonight's Zoom presentation is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook and will be available for viewing on the Print London YouTube site. I'll now turn over to Cindy Talbot, who will do our land acknowledgement and advise on how to have the best viewing experience on Zoom tonight. Cindy?
Good evening and welcome. I'm Cindy Talbot, Vice Chair of Print London. We are hosting tonight's event from London, Ontario. We acknowledge that the land on which Print London gathers is the territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape-Pewak peoples who have long-standing relationships to the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. The local First Nation communities of this area include Chippewas of the Thames First Nations, Oneida Nation of the Thames, the Munsee Delaware Nation. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations of Turtle Island, North America. So I've also got some housekeeping notes for you all, technical housekeeping notes for those who are joining on Zoom. For optimal viewing on a laptop, you need to select the speaker view. So to do that, you would click View in the upper right corner of your Zoom window, then click Speaker View. To avoid distractions, we have muted your mic and turned off your video, and we ask that you stay in that position for the remainder of the presentation. We will be fielding questions during the presentation for Emma to answer. If you would like to ask a question, we ask you to type it into the chat box, and our moderator, Jocelyn Gardner, will read the questions to Emma. So in order to do that, if you're joining from a laptop, you should see a toolbar along the bottom of your screen. That would be the Zoom bar. Click on the three dots and more, then click chat. Select the option to send the chat to everyone. That way everybody will see the question and we won't have duplications. If you're on a cellular device, tap your screen to bring up the toolbar, click the chat icon and select the option to send to everyone again. If you're viewing through Facebook Live, you can type your question directly into the discussion box below the live stream, and I'll pass them along to Jocelyn in the Zoom chat and she'll pose them to Emma. So I think that takes care of everything. Jocelyn, I'll pass it back to you.
Hey, thank you, Cindy. So now I'd like to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Emma Nishimura. Sorry, letting someone in. I first met Emma at Open Studio around 2007 and have been well acquainted with her work since that time, if even from a distance. Inspired by her family history, her work is an ongoing exploration into the myriad layers contained within stories, memories, and complicated histories. For over 10 years, she has been researching, collecting, recording, and archiving hundreds of personal accounts related to the forced incarceration of thousands of Japanese Canadians in the Second World War and in the years after. With sensitivity, exquisite detail, and sensuous fragility, her work honors their experiences and addresses the space between remembering and forgetting. Her most extensive series to date, An Archive of Rememory, has been featured widely internationally, winning her the Queen Sonja Print Award in Norway, Art in Print's Prix de Print, and the Grand Prix at the 11th International Contemporary Printmaking Biennale of Trois-Rivières, Quebec. She was also one of 10 finalists at the Print Center's online 92nd Annual International Competition. Recent exhibitions of note have included Rememory, Echoes and Archives at United Contemporary in Toronto, where she exhibited works from a recently completed residency in Sweden. Generational Echoes, a solo exhibition at Nelson Museum, BC. Paper Borders, a two-person show at the International Print Center, New York. And The Medium is the Message, a three-person show at the Art Gallery of Ontario, where newly acquired works were on display. Her work has also been featured in a 2020 CBC documentary and is currently touring Canada in a group exhibition titled Broken Promises that thematically explores the dispossession of Japanese Canadians through illuminating the loss of home and the struggle for justice of this racially marginalized community. Emma works primarily with photo intaglio, archival pigment prints, and sculptural papermaking processes. She received her MFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and her BA from the University of Guelph. She is currently an assistant professor and the chair of photography, printmaking, and publications at OCAD University in Toronto. We're excited to welcome Emma to present her work to us tonight. And I'll ask her now to turn on her camera and PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I'm gonna share my screen here. All right, just checking. You can see a box on there and not my entry notes.
Yes.
Awesome. So first off, just a really big, wonderful thank you to the invitation to be here. It's really lovely to share my work with everyone here tonight. And I want to extend a thank you to Print London and really specifically to Jocelyn. It's we've known each other for a long time, and it's we've had so much correspondence over the last while, and it's just really lovely to see you this evening. So thank you for the very warm welcome. Reading my list, it's been a reminder that it's been a busy few years. I managed bedtime with my two kids before this talk, so we're all good. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about my work. I'm going to focus on a lot of the intaglio projects, but I left a few pieces and a few different projects in that aren't intaglio based because I wanted to really kind of paint the picture of how different ideas emerged. And as you'll see, kind of a lot of my thinking is somewhat linear and then kind of tangential. So it's helpful to kind of come along on the journey. And so I'm starting with this picture of this margarine box up here. So it's actually 15 years ago that I found this box now. And so in 2008, I received a grant from the Ontario government. I had written a grant and proposed a project to look at what it was to be mixed race. I'm half Japanese Canadian on my dad's side, Scottish Canadian on my mom's, very Canadian on both sides, really. So I proposed to make this body of work. I got the grant, and I went to my mom's house and went into the basement and tried to find all these old photo albums that I knew existed of my grandparents, and I couldn't find anything. But what I did find was this box. And so my grandmother had died about 5 years before, and anything that was sewing related went to me, in which case it was stored in my mom's basement. And so I opened up this box because I'd done a lot of sewing as well. So when I opened up this box, I discovered about 200 of these, kind of these amazing, immaculate garments, all made of brown craft paper. Kind of so much detail. And then in addition to all of these little garments, these are all kind of 4 to 6 inches tall, were 5 books of patterns. And these were dated 1941. So my grandmother was 18 when she took this course. And at this time, and she was living in Vancouver at the time, There weren't a lot of opportunities for employment for Japanese Canadian women. And so she had taken this drafting course with the intention to be a seamstress. And so I grew up knowing that she knew how to sew, but I just didn't really know anything about her education and really how she learned how to sew. As you go through the books, there's a pattern for every mock-up. And it's just kind of, the detail was astounding, and there's this lovely mix of English and Japanese. Inside one of those pattern books, there's a sheaf of notebook pages, and this was dated February 1943. And so in 1943, at this time, my grandmother was living in Spokane City, an internment camp for Japanese Canadians within the interior of British Columbia. And she was clearly making clothes for other internees. These pages are full of Japanese names and measurements. And just before I dive into the work that I made in response, I just want to touch briefly on the history, just to give a little bit more context, kind of really what was happening in 43 at this point in time. So kind of 2 years earlier, so December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. December 8th, Japanese Canadians were categorized as enemy aliens under the War Measures Act, which began to remove their personal rights. Over the next 2 months, 1,200 Japanese Canadian-owned boats were impounded as a defense measure. My great-grandfather's fishing boat was seized during this time. February 24th, 1942, the Canadian government issued an executive order authorizing the removal of all persons of Japanese racial origin within a 100-mile radius of the BC coast. So during this time, all Japanese Canadians' possessions were destroyed or sold by the Canadian government. The proceeds from these sales helped to fund the internment. Then April 1942, approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians were sent to internment camps in British Columbia, sugar beet farms in Manitoba and Alberta, self-supporting camps, road camps, or POW camps. Women, children, and older men were sent to live in the camps. Able-bodied men were all sent to work on road camps throughout the interior of BC. So my grandmother and her family were sent to Spokane City. And so there's a photo on the right of my grandmother, and kind of a group of, and this would have been before they built permanent shelters. You can see some tents behind them. And then my grandfather, he worked on a road camp and built part of the Trans-Canada Highway. And you can see a picture maybe of him on the left-hand side. These were from his photo album, right? Then in 1945, when the war ended, Japanese Canadians were given two options. They could move east, or they could go to Japan. Most of them had were born in Canada, and so in essence, were really deported to Japan for those who chose to leave. But what was really interesting is Japanese Canadians weren't allowed to return to the coast until 1949. And so what this meant is, pretty much not a lot of people returned because everyone was forced to move east. And so kind of communities, the Canadian government didn't want the community that had existed prior to in Vancouver and in on the coast to exist again. So this was all about this forced assimilation. And so when I really was thinking about this box and my grandmother's experience, I was thinking about what I learned as a kid sitting around the table. I knew that they had been interned. I knew kind of basics of their story, but not a lot of details. My sister and I would listen. My mom, the daughter-in-law, would ask the questions. I think she felt like she had a little bit more permission to ask questions than my dad ever did. And so I really wanted to I found this box and struggled initially. It was several months before I could figure out what I wanted to do with it, and how did I explore her story and start navigating this history. And so I really started with the patterns, and I learned how to read her dressmaking patterns, and I wanted to kind of echo this use of paper, She had used brown craft paper, so I worked with Japanese paper, and I kind of figured out these patterns and made my own paper mock-ups. And so began kind of my journey of retracing her actions. And I started making this series of work. I worked on this series called Button's Patterns for about 2 or 3 years. And I was really thinking about ideas of assimilation. Growing up, there was no Japantown in Toronto. There's no Japantown in Vancouver. Things have started to emerge now. But for me, it was important to understand why those communities didn't exist growing up for me. And I really had to go back to the history of the internment and this forced assimilation and forced dispersal across the country. And so this series was really exploring those ideas of, how the Canadian government wanted Japanese Canadians to really disappear, and how the Japanese Canadians themselves also wanted to really become part of the fabric of Canadian society and not ever have an internment happen again. And so these are all, I used existing etchings that I had and was revisiting them and printing them numerous times and then creating these garments out of the prints and then stitching them. So these are all then framed in kind of a shadow box. So I think someone once called them 2.5D. Before they're mounted, those garments are fully 3-dimensional, but then they're mounted onto a backing board. And so I used kind of different layers of kind of veiling some of the inner imagery, all working for the most part with Gampi. And lots of paper cutting. And I was really kind of trying to echo how she had worked with those paper garments. So stitching the side of the garments on the outside, on the inside. And so this series carried on for, kind of took me to grad school. And then this last piece here, these last 2 pieces in the series are very printmakerly, in that the kind of brownish pink garment that you're seeing is a soft ground etching. And so I was interested in kind of recording the trace of this garment. So I was able to take one of her paper garments and run it through the press and capture that impression through a soft ground etching. And I was thinking about kind of where my grandmother's actions and where her patterns end and where mine begin, and kind of what's that space in between kind of me and her and this story. And really harnessing all that printmaking has to offer in terms of the multiple, the trace, and the original, of all of those ideas. And so I created my own dimensional dress that kind of exists between these prints. And I made those dresses just using the plate tone that surrounded all of these garments. So I printed this plate probably about 20 times and then cut it up and layered and pieced things together. So this was called Echoes from the Space Between One, and that was the front. And then this is the back of it. And then, so I had worked on the series for a number of years and then knew it was a time to shift and do something a bit different. And people kept saying, are you done with that box? Are you ready to move on? And I just kept digging in my heels saying, no, I'm not ready to move on. There's still so much history I haven't explored and so many ideas I haven't tackled yet. And so I made a life-size garment. I made a life-size dress that would fit me. And the first time I made it, I sewed it on the sewing machine and made it all kind of continuing to use Japanese paper and still kind of echoing my grandmother's use of paper for those mock-ups. And I made this first garment and I didn't like it. And so I crumpled it all up and then I unfolded it. And all of a sudden, all of these creases, the paper will remember all of those creases. And it took on this whole other life of its own. And using Japanese paper felt like it made so much sense for me. It's what I love to work with, but also it looks so fragile, but it's so strong. And so I made this dress, and then I was thinking about what this box had come to represent over time. And I'd moved the box around with me in Toronto. It had moved with me to grad school in the States, in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it had become this weight and this representation of my grandparents' story and all the baggage that was associated with. And so I wanted to kind of, basically, I kind of embarked on a personal performance for the next several weeks. I took a square of paper, a large square of Japanese paper, and I put the garment in it, and then I tied it up. And I was working with this idea of a furoshiki. How do we, kind of this, it's got a great history in the Japanese wrapping, traditional wrapping culture, where you can wrap up a gift, you can wrap up, it can be very utilitarian, you can wrap up your lunch. So I used a square of paper and wrapped up the garment and started carrying it with me. And then the next week I made another garment, and then I made another garment. And so for probably about a month and a half, this bag started to grow. And it was really this idea of kind of carrying this baggage with me. In the end, this resulted in a show. So all of these garments were hung from the ceiling at about my height, all made of gampi, and kind of the buttons are all paper, and I enjoyed working with all those details. And I also really enjoyed not printing at this time, and I was in grad school for printmaking. But what was really lovely was there was a lot of faculty who were supporting kind of my desire to dive into the work that I needed to make at the time. And so that was much appreciated by me. So I made maybe a dozen garments. And so this is an installation shot of the show. From the ceiling, I also had 4 different speakers. And this was kind of when I began recording oral histories. And so I recorded my mother's version of my grandmother's experience, and I recorded my aunt's version of my mom's experience. And so my mother, the daughter-in-law, versus my aunt, the daughter. And then I recorded a conversation between myself and my sister. And that conversation was very short because at the time we really didn't remember that much. And what I was really intrigued with was comparing the stories of my mom and my aunt. And there were a lot of similarities, but then there were significant differences, and kind of just really intrigued with how memory gets so corrupted over time and conflated with other stories and takes on its own life, and that we can't ever really know those whole stories. And so while I was working on this project, I took kind of a family pilgrimage with my mom and my sister out west, and I wanted to go and see the landscape that was the internment, was the site of internment for so many Japanese Canadians. And so I went out. Oh, sorry, there's one more installation shot there. And here is kind of some photographs from that trip out west, and it's beautiful. And I think initially what myself and my family were so intrigued with was that it's just this beautiful place, and it's hard to reconcile that beauty with what happened. And I came home from that trip and didn't really know what to do, because I had hundreds of photographs of this beautiful scenic area. And I printed them out, and they looked like beautiful photographs. They didn't kind of delve into the history that I needed to be talking about. And so, as seems to be the case, and Nancy Jacoby, I saw that you were here, so I love that you're here. I decided to print these on Japanese paper, and then all of a sudden, kind of my world was unlocked in terms of how to work with these images. And so I printed the digital images onto Gampi and cut everything up. And then all of a sudden I could tell a different kind of a story. And so this was the beginning of a series of 9 prints. where this horizon line connects each place to the next. And I was interested in this idea of how do we connect place with memory and how do we make that visible. This landscape has seen so much over the years, but has changed so little. And this was my sky that I experienced, but this land that really is relatively unchanged from when my grandparents were there. And so the piece starts off in full color, and then as the work progresses, the color slowly fades away. There's elements of paper cutting. This is a pattern from my aunt's kimono in this one. This horizon line kind of connects each piece and really kind of offers that kind of shifting sense of grounding, but it also divides and separates the sky from the land. And so as we go, then the clouds start getting cut away. And so here's a process shot, lots of paper cutting. And these also get sewn at the end as well. So then the land starts to get more significantly cut away. And a lot of what I was thinking here, and this is really a theme running throughout my work always, is this present absence of the stories that are shared over the years. And kind of really being conscious of what hasn't been shared. And that some of those things haven't been shared for a number of different reasons. Some are forgotten, but then some were not shared for, to be kept secret, or that stories people weren't comfortable with sharing. And so we'll go through the series, and then these last two images, this one and the next, are really just white on white. And depending on your screen, I'm not sure how much you can see, but these are actually photo intaglio prints now. And so I was interested in, from a process perspective, when you're printing a digital print, white is just the absence of ink. And so, it's just the white comes from the paper that you're printing on. So I started in color, but then was manipulating these images and slowly kind of taking the color out of them and removing the saturation, so that these photographs are kind of almost disappearing. So thinking about these memories that fade over time. But then from a photo intaglio perspective, and from a printmaking perspective, we can print white ink. So I took a photograph from one of my grandfather's photo albums. So this is from the 1940s sky. And if I could, I printed the photo etching in white ink. And if you held up that photo on Japanese paper to light, you would be able to see this cloudscape. But I decided to mount them on this mat board, so you really can't see any of that cloudscape. You can see subtle hints in this one. By this last print, you really can't see anything. And so this was really kind of thinking about all of those stories that were not necessarily forgotten, they just weren't shared. There was so much silence associated with the internment, and really a generation that, kind of generalizing here, a generation that didn't want to talk about it. It was too painful. It was about moving on. There were so many different reasons for not talking. There is talk now, but it's complicated. And so this is an installation shot of 8 of those 9 panels. And I was really interested in a theory called post-memory. It's developed by Marianne Hirsch, who's done a lot of research around the Holocaust. And so she's really saying, so post-memory can be seen as a structure of inter and transgenerational transmission of traumatic knowledge and experience. And really thinking that kind of these subsequent generations kind of really inherit these traumatic memories. And then it's the struggle of what to do with those, and how do we navigate that, and how do we tell those stories. And so I've been doing lots of reading through all of this, and I did this pilgrimage and was kind of mapping from just purely as we were navigating the land, looking at the map a lot, but then coming home and trying to map out where these different internment campsites were, and placing those. So I wanted to create my own map. And so this image here is an installation shot of an ongoing series called Constructed Narratives. At first glance, it looks like a collection of frames kind of in an odd arrangement on the wall. When you look up close, it's a map of the interior of British Columbia. And so I initially chose areas that were important to my family's story. And so I chose Slocan Lake, where my grandmother was interned, the section of road my grandfather was working on, and then Vernon, where my dad was born. And then I was kind of building this map to connect those areas. And over time, this map has grown to be more reflective of the larger Japanese Canadian experience. But we need to get in close to kind of understand the layers that I was thinking about here. So this piece is called Revelstoke. And this piece, if you get up really close, it's all text. So kind of backing out here a little bit, I was doing all of this reading and really wanted to include all of my research in a much more physical and real way into the work. So I discovered that I can write really small, and I made these etchings. It's 2 plates, and the text I was using changed depending on what section of map I was in. For this piece, for Revelstoke, I used texts that talk about men's first-hand accounts of what it was like to work in the road camps. And so there's the blue grayish plate is all the lakes and rivers, the water systems, and then there's a plate that I print in black ink, and that's all the roads. And so here's some details. I show this series with some magnifying glasses alongside it, and really encourage people to get up close. And then I also include all the bibliographic references that I've used, and the sources for all of these transcriptions. I found that kind of being able to share that research and sharing the sources has been it just feels like the right thing to do, but also is this wonderful talking point, especially to other Japanese Canadians who've also kind of been working hard on this research. I think the mark making on a conceptual level is also really interesting for the works when I'm writing. Kind of the difference of writing a letter and a word or a whole essay is very different than drawing a line, and a different way that then, you know, to read it on the page versus transcribing it, I'm kind of taking this history in a different way. This piece is called Slocan Lake, and so the text from this piece comes from 2 different sources. One, it comes from the novel Obasan, written by Joy Kagawa. And so I read this novel as in high school and probably a bit younger, and then read it later as an adult. And so Joy Kagawa was in the same camp as my grandmother. And so I knew this growing up, and I remember reading it in high school and talking about it with my grandmother, but I don't think we got into any specifics, and it's amazing what I can't remember. But what I found really interesting was then when I reread Obasan as an adult, what I thought had been my grandmother's experience was really the main character in the novel story. And I was just amazed at how my memory had conflated these stories. So I used text from Obasan, and then I also used text from Kirsten McAllister, who's a researcher and scholar looking at a memorial that's been built in New Denver, that's along Slocan Lake, where another of the camps was. And she's looking at the community that's living there now, and there are some Japanese Canadians there, and then what this memorial has done for that community. So kind of really wanting to look at that history, but also looking at it from a contemporary perspective as well. And here's a close-up of that one. So I also do a lot of paper cutting in these map pieces. Instead of printing both plates on the same piece of paper, I print them on separate pieces of paper and then cut and layer. And it just felt like it was going to be more fun. So here's kind of an image of that map piece in its entirety here. And so while I was working on this, I like to work on kind of a number of different series at the same time keeps my brain doing different things and keeps my body doing different things too. I can only write tiny for so long. And so while I was doing all of this, I actually was able to find and locate these family photograph albums. And over the years, I just kept coming back to these albums. So there's an album, this album is from my grandmother's album. And it details her life. She was born in Vancouver, kind of raised in Japan, and then came back to Canada just before the war. So this is my grandmother and her mom in 41. And this is actually the same year that she was taking that drafting course. So just, I mean, amazing outfits in this too. And then the album goes into her time in the camps. And there's just this like lovely arrangement in these photo albums. And some of the photographs are autographed by friends. There's kind of practical questions I had that I wished I could ask my grandmother as to how these photos exist. So when the call came that everyone had to leave and go to the camps, all cameras were confiscated. So I've talked to some who were interned and they said they just ordered cameras from the Eaton's catalog and they got cameras that way. So I was totally shocked by that. But kind of lovely layers. This is my grandfather's album. So this details his time in the work camps. And, you know, talking about to my aunt about these, she said that growing up, looking at these albums with my grandfather, he just only ever said, "This is where I worked," and gave no context for why he was working there. And so, you know, I found these albums and kept going back to them and was trying to figure out how I could work with these and how I could share more of their history and talk about kind of the weight of these memories. And so I had taken a photogravure workshop and turned a couple of these photographs into photogravures and then was able to print those onto Japanese paper and started to play in the sculptural form of what I might be able to do. And I thought back to the furoshiki that I had made and that I had used to carry around these garments that I'd made. And I did some more research into the history of the furoshiki, and it has a history of more than 1,200 years. Kind of historical uses range from keeping valuables of emperors safe in the 6th century to wrapping and carrying clothes for nobility in the 10th centuries, to kind of current day, this tradition of wrapping gifts or wrapping goods, and it really implies respect to others. And so I thought this would be kind of this great form to work with. And so this was one of the first images that I used. This was, my grandmother is on the far left in this image, and she's there with her 2 sisters. So this is when she went to Japan from Vancouver with her mom and went to stay with her grandparents. And so then I turned it into a furoshiki. This is actually no longer printed on Japanese paper. What I discovered, so at this point I came back from grad school and took a paper making workshop from Paper House in Toronto, a great paper making studio. And I approached them and said, you know, I want to do this sculptural process. Is this possible? And sorry, so then I took a workshop with them and did some experimenting and figured it out. And so for this, I'll get into process in a second. I'll kind of show you some more images. I was really thinking about kind of, again, the weight of memory and how do we pack and store away these memories? How do we pass on stories to future generations? How do we take care of things? How do we kind of preserve this history? And so I made numerous bundles. I think I've probably made over 400 at this point. If you haven't realized, I like doing things. I like doing the same thing a lot. As many of you as printmakers here, you will, I'm sure, appreciate that. Sorry, I just have to cough here. I'm just gonna mute myself for a second. Depending on how I wrap the bundle, how I wrap the furoshiki, different elements of the photograph are revealed and other areas are concealed. So you can see this is the same image, but then just wrapped differently. This is me, kind of just a little idea of scale. And so what I love about these images, about the form, is that they look heavy, but they actually weigh nothing. And so from a process perspective, I make a mold of sand and wrap it in some saran wrap and a nylon stocking. And then I hand make the paper. And so generally for making the paper, I am, for regular handmade paper, you beat it in a paper beater for kind of maybe 45 minutes. This pulp has been beaten for 5 to 6 hours. So the fibers are really, really short. And so we make the paper and then I leave it damp and I bring it home in a damp pack. So the paper is never dried. And then I take it out of the damp pack, let it dry a little bit. And then I ink up my photo intaglio plate with these photographs on it. And then I print on the damp paper and I immediately wrap it around my mold. And then I let everything sit for several days. And then I cut a hole in the bottom. You can see there's kind of a little bit of and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, kind of a triangle arrow in the bottom. And then I'm able to drain out all the sand and take out kind of all the wrapping from the mold. And then I patch up the bottom and these are entirely weightless. And so conceptually that worked very well for how I was thinking about these. This is a photo of my grandfather. He was also born in Vancouver, but then raised in Japan for several years. And so this was his passport photo coming back to Canada. Here's a photo of my grandfather in front of the truck he drove when he was working the road crew. And then the furoshiki that kind of corresponds to that image. So you can see, most people don't get to see the whole image. It's really only when I give talks that you get to see the whole image. So when the photos are bundled, you can't see the whole image. And that's part of the point, is you can't see that whole story. And you might want to untie these furoshiki, but you can't. This paper is dried and this bundle is kind of, you can't get in. And so thinking of kind of really so much of this history is inaccessible. I also have a number of these bundles that are unprinted, kind of as markers for these stories that haven't been shared. I've shown these in a number of different iterations and different kind of installations. This was from my show at Open Studio. And so I'm just keeping an eye on time. I got chatting about other things. So I might end on this note with this series of prints. But these prints are from a series called Collected Stories. And so again, thinking about this furoshiki form, and I really started working with interviewing other Japanese Canadians and recording their oral histories and transcribing those. And so these pieces are all text. And I really think of these pieces as portraits. And they take me kind of 4 to 6 months to complete. It's a lot of writing and overwriting to build up the density. But it's been this interesting way of really connecting with the Japanese Canadian community and being able to record different stories and being conscious of interviewing people from different generations. Those who were interned, as well as those who are the children of internees and the grandkids. So this is an ongoing series. And Jocelyn, just checking in if I have kind of 3 more minutes just to show a couple more.
You can go ahead, Emma. This is beautiful. Go ahead.
Okay. And I can answer lots of questions actually. So this is an ongoing series, but I just wanted to briefly talk about these most recent photo etchings that I've done. And so I did a residency most recent. It doesn't feel so recent anymore. COVID happened, and I had 2 babies. So in 2019, I did a residency in Sweden as part of this prize that I won from the Queen Sonja for the Queen Sonja Print Award. I got a residency in Sweden, and so I arrived, and they said, you know, what do we want to do, and what can you not usually do? So we worked large, and we also this was kind of mid-size. So we made a suite of 9 prints. And so kind of this is a selection of them. And so initially I was using, this whole series uses documentation from my Archive of Memory series. And in these prints, I'm really interested in continuing to explore those ideas of post-memory, of how subsequent generations will remember and pass on these stories of trauma. But what's interesting for here is that, you know, and I know we're looking at everything in two dimension anyways, but thinking of, you know, I have this sculptural representation that you could pick up and you could hold in your hand and turn around and see this whole image. Now what's happened is this is a documentation of that sculpture. You can no longer pick it up. You can no longer see other elements of that photo. Only one perspective has been preserved. And so kind of really thinking of what happens through history and happens through storytelling and who's telling those stories. So photographic fragments that can be seen through these furoshikis, but and they're kind of these historical markers and there's evidence, but much more of the story has been lost, really. And from a process perspective, what I was interested in is, you know, they start off as an original photograph that's then turned into a photo etching, photogravure, then it's turned into a sculpture, then it's turned into another the digital photo documentation of it, then it's turned into a photo etching, and then it's printed onto paper. So thinking of kind of those generations of storytelling from a process perspective as well. And I'll just leave you with kind of printing really big. And so these were some larger prints that I was also able to make in Sweden. So fun to play with scale of the furoshikis and to keep thinking about storytelling. But I'm going to wrap up there and open it up to some questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Well, there are a few questions in the chat, Emma. One from Libby asking, did your mother, maybe she meant the grandmother, have a sewing machine, or did she have to sew by hand?
I think she probably brought her sewing machine. And it's also remarkable because all of these patterns existed. So when they went to the camps, it was take only what you can carry. And so I'm very confused with how that happened, because they also needed to bring pots and pans. But thinking about kind of how much she kind of prioritized these patterns and her sewing machine. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So there's a comment from Sandy, beautiful, thoughtful, and very timeless way to honor your grandparents. Thank you for sharing. And Susan, such amazing work, beautiful. I'd like to say, yeah, it's been a really powerful and moving presentation, Emma. We're really grateful that you were able to share the personal aspects of the history, you know, that make up this work. It just is so strong on so many levels. Really lovely.
Thank you. Lovely to share it here, and I see so many names that are very familiar, and it's lovely to know that you're all here.
Yeah, there's another comment. Breathtaking, Emma. Thank you. Do we have anybody that wants to speak? Sorry. I asked to turn on my camera. Yes, here's Nancy. Sorry, there's one before. What size of editions of your work from Sweden, or are they editions?
Yeah, editions. The smaller prints are editions of 20 each, and then the large prints are just an edition of 5 each. And then this was the first time that I had other people print my work, so that was an interesting experience, to kind of give over that control, but also amazingly freeing because they can finish editions. I'm not great at. I have a lot of ongoing open editions in my work.
Okay, so there's one, I can see there's a comment before, but I'm not able to access it right now, so I'll read Nancy's. Can you speak about the difference between printing on the Gampi and on your own paper?
I would say printing on the Gampi is much more controllable. It works beautifully every time. Printing on the handmade paper is more challenging because I'm using it in a sculptural way. It has to be just the right amount of wet versus dry. So if the paper is slightly too wet, then the image just kind of slides away and things look kind of fuzzy, but sometimes that can really work. And I'm more than happy for that to happen. And then if things are too dry, then the print kind of looks too dry itself. And then it's more difficult to tie up. So it's, yeah, kind of different challenges.
Okay, so there's a comment from Linda. Such beautiful and moving work, Emma. I'm in Salmon Arm and see that your grandfather worked here for a well-known company.
Oh, there you go. Oh, amazing. I didn't know that the company still existed. So yeah, his road crew was between Revelstoke and Salmon Arm. And his team was called Yard Creek. That's really interesting. So yeah, I have a whole print of Salmon Arm.
Wow. So I don't read French. And the next comment is from Tolivier.
She's just saying that she saw her work in Three Rivers, and since then she's been a fan, an admirer.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think your work is, is very memorable, Emma. And I think when, anyone sees it, they're not going to forget it because it touches you and it's just, yeah, it's so moving, so rich in every possible way that, yeah, you don't forget it. And I've certainly had that experience with it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if we're going to get any more questions. It's been really wonderful to have you here, Emma. We really appreciate you taking time, especially with 2 little kids, to put to bed.
I think I hear one crying upstairs. So
oh dear, and your busy schedule. You're an exceptionally busy person. So thank you very much. Print London really appreciates it. I'd like to thank everyone who's here tonight. We do have one more talk coming up in this series. On June 29th, we'll have Tim Lauren. I think Tim's here tonight. So we don't want to miss that. June 29th, Tim will be here. And yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone. if you want to revisit the talk, it is on the Facebook live stream, and it will be posted in probably a week or so on the YouTube. So thank you so much for coming tonight, everyone. Print London appreciates you being here. Thanks very much, and we'll see you on the 29th, hopefully.